Hey, welcome to my weirding hour. Hope you'll settle in, get comfortable. Have something quite vintage for you tonight. E.T.A. Hoffmann's The Sandman. This will be a single installment, if my calculations are correct. I think it likely that tomorrow night we'll begin a two-parter in Welshman Macken's The Great God Pan. All right, hope you're well, holding up, etc. Hope you're in a comfortable place. The Sandman, E.T.A. Hoffmann. Nathaniel to Lothair. Certainly you must all be uneasy that I have not written for so long, so very long. My mother, I am sure, is angry, and Clara will believe that I am passing my time in dissipation, entirely forgetful of her fair, angelic image that is so deeply imprinted on my heart. Such, however, is not the case. Daily and hourly I think of you all, and the dear form of my lovely Clara passes before me in my dreams, smiling upon me with her bright eyes as she did when I was among you. But how can I write to you in the distracted mood which has been disturbing my every thought? A horrible thing has crossed my path. Dark forebodings of a cruel, threatening fate tower over me like dark clouds which no friendly sunbeam can penetrate. I will now tell you what has occurred. I must do so, that I plainly see. The mere thought of it sets me laughing like a madman. Ah, my dear Lothair, how shall I begin? How shall I make you in any way realize that what happened to me a few days ago can really have had such a fatal effect on my life? If you were here, you could see for yourself, but as it is, you will certainly take me for a crazy fellow who sees ghosts. To be brief, this horrible occurrence, the painful impression of which I am in vain endeavoring to throw off, is nothing more than this, that some days ago, namely on the 30th of October at 12 o'clock noon, a barometer dealer came into my room and offered me his wares. I bought nothing and threatened to throw him downstairs, upon which he took himself off of his own accord. Only circumstances of the most peculiar kind, you will suspect, and exerting the greatest influence over my life, can have given any import to this occurrence. Moreover, the person of that unlucky dealer must have had an evil effect upon me. So it was indeed. I must use every endeavor to collect myself and patiently and quietly tell you so much of my early youth as will bring the picture plainly and clearly before your eyes. As I am about to begin, I fancy that I hear you laughing, and Clara exclaiming, "Childish stories indeed." Laugh at me, I beg of you. Laugh with all your heart. But, oh God, my hair stands on end, and it is in mad desire that I seem to be inviting your laughter, as Franz Moore did Daniel's in Schiller's play. But to my story. Excepting at dinner time, I and my brothers and sisters used to see my father very little during the day. He was, perhaps, busily engaged at his ordinary profession. After supper, which was served according to the old custom at 7 o'clock, we all went with my mother into my father's study and seated ourselves at the round table, where he would smoke and drink his large glass of beer. Often he told us wonderful stories, and grew so warm over them that his pipe continually went out. Whereupon I had to light it again, and with a burning spill, which I thought great sport. Often, too, he would give us picture books and sit in his armchair, silent and thoughtful, puffing out such thick clouds of smoke that we all seemed to be swimming in the clouds. On such evenings as these, my mother was very melancholy, and immediately the clock struck 9, she would say, "Now, children, to bed, the Sandman's coming, I can see." And indeed, on each occasion I used to hear something with a heavy, slow step come thudding up the stairs that I thought must be the Sandman. Once, when the dull noise of footsteps was particularly terrifying, I asked my mother as she bore us away, "Mama, who is this naughty Sandman who always drives us away from Papa? What does he look like?" "There is no Sandman, dear child," replied my mother. "When I say the Sandman's coming, I only mean that you're sleepy and can't keep your eyes open. Just as if sand had been sprinkled into them." This answer of my mother's did not satisfy me. Nay, the thought soon ripened in my childish mind that she only denied the Sandman's existence to prevent our being terrified of him. Certainly I always heard him coming up the stairs. Most curious to know more of this Sandman and his particular connection with children, I at last asked the old woman who looked after my youngest sister what sort of man he was. "Natty," said she, "don't you know that yet? He is a wicked man, who comes to children when they won't go to bed, and throws a handful of sand into their eyes so that they start out bleeding from their heads. He puts their eyes in a bag and carries them to the crescent moon to feed his own children, who sit in the nest up there. They have crooked beaks like owls so that they can pick up the eyes of naughty human children." A most frightful picture of the cruel Sandman became impressed upon my mind, so that when in the evening I heard the noise on the stairs, I trembled with agony and alarm, and my mother could get nothing out of me but the cry, "The Sandman! The Sandman!" stuttered forth through my tears. I then ran into the bedroom, where the frightful apparition of the Sandman terrified me during the whole night. I had already grown old enough to realize that the nurse's tale about him and the nest of children in the crescent moon could not be quite true, but nevertheless this Sandman remained a fearful spectre, and I seized with the utmost horror when I heard him once not only come up the stairs, but violently force my father's door open and go in. Sometimes he stayed away for a long period, but after that his visits came in close succession. This lasted for years, but I could not accustom myself to the terrible goblin. The image of the dreadful Sandman did not become any fainter. His intercourse with my father began more and more to occupy my fancy. Yet an unconquerable fear prevented me from asking my father about it. But if I myself could penetrate the mystery and behold the wondrous Sandman, that was the wish which grew upon me with the years. The Sandman had introduced me to thoughts of the marvels and wonders which so readily gain a hold on a child's mind. I enjoyed nothing better than reading or hearing horrible stories of goblins, witches, pygmies, etc., but most horrible of all was the Sandman, whom I was always drawing with chalk or charcoal on the tables, cupboards, and walls in the oddest and most frightful shapes. When I was 10 years old, my mother removed me from the night nursery into a little chamber situated in a corridor near my father's room. Still, as before, we were obliged to make a speedy departure on the stroke of 9, as soon as the unknown step sounded on the stair. From my little chamber I could hear how he entered my father's room, and then it was that I seemed to detect a thin vapor with a singular odor spreading through the house. Stronger and stronger with my curiosity grew my resolution somehow to make the Sandman's acquaintance. Often I sneaked from my room to the corridor when my mother had passed, but never could I discover anything, for the Sandman had always gone in at the door when I reached the place where I might have seen him. At last, driven by an irresistible impulse, I resolved to hide myself in my father's room and await his appearance there. From my father's silence and my mother's melancholy face, I perceived one evening that the Sandman was coming. I, therefore, feigned great weariness, left the room before 9 o'clock, and hid myself in a corner close to the door. The house door groaned, and the heavy, slow, creaking step came up the passage and toward the stairs. My mother passed me with the rest of the children. Softly, very softly, I opened the door of my father's room. He was sitting, as usual, stiff and silent, with his back to the door. He did not perceive me, and I swiftly darted into the room and behind the curtain which covered an open cupboard close to the door, in which my father's clothes were hanging. The steps sounded nearer and nearer. There was a strange coughing and scraping and murmuring without. My heart trembled with anxious expectation. A sharp step close, very close to the door, the quick snap of the latch, and the door opened with a rattling noise. Screwing up my courage to the uttermost, I cautiously peeped out. The Sandman was standing before my father in the middle of the room. The light of the candles shone full upon his face. The Sandman, the fearful Sandman, was the old advocate Coppelius, who had often dined with us. But the most hideous form could not have inspired me with deeper horror than this very Coppelius. Imagine a large, broad-shouldered man with a head disproportionately big, a face the color of yellow ochre, a pair of bushy gray eyebrows from beneath which a pair of green cat's eyes sparkled with the most penetrating luster, and with a large nose curved over his upper lip. His wry mouth was often twisted into a malicious laugh when a couple of dark red spots appeared upon his cheeks, and a strange hissing sound was heard through his gritted teeth. Coppelius always appeared in an ashen-gray coat, cut in old-fashioned style, with waistcoat and breeches of the same color, while his stockings were black, and his shoes adorned with agate buckles. His little peruke scarcely reached farther than the crown of his head. His curls stood high above his large red ears, and a broad hair bag projected stiffly from his neck, so that the silver clasp which fastened his folded cravat might be plainly seen. His whole figure was hideous and repulsive, but most disgusting to us children were his coarse, brown, hairy fists. Indeed, we did not like to eat anything he had touched with them. This he had noticed, and it was his delight, under some pretext or other, to touch a piece of cake or some nice fruit that our kind mother might quietly have put on our plates, just for the pleasure of seeing us turn away with tears in our eyes, in disgust and abhorrence, no longer able to enjoy the treat intended for us. He acted in the same manner on holidays when my father gave us a little glass of sweet wine. Then would he swiftly put his hand over it, or perhaps even raise the glass to his blue lips, laughing most devilishly, and we could only express our indignation by silent sobs. He always called us the little beasts. We dared not utter a sound when he was present, and we heartily cursed the ugly, unkind man who deliberately marred our slightest pleasures. My mother seemed to hate the repulsive Coppelius as much as we did, since as soon as he showed himself, her liveliness, her open and cheerful nature, were changed for a gloomy solemnity. My father behaved towards him as though he were a superior being, whose bad manners were to be tolerated and who was to be kept in good humor at all cost. He need only give the slightest hint, and favorite dishes were cooked, the choicest wines served. When I now saw this Coppelius, the frightful and terrific thought took possession of my soul that indeed no one but he could be the Sandman. But the Sandman was no longer the bogey of a nurse's tale who provided the owl's nest in the crescent moon with children's eyes. No, he was a hideous, spectral monster who brought with him grief, misery, and destruction, temporal and eternal, wherever he appeared. I was riveted to the spot, as if enchanted. At the risk of being discovered, and, as I plainly foresaw, of being severely punished, I remained with my head peeping through the curtain. My father received Coppelius with solemnity. "Now to our work," cried the latter in a harsh, grating voice as he flung off his coat. My father silently and gloomily drew off his dressing gown, and both attired themselves in long black frocks. Whence they took these I did not see. My father opened the door of what I had always thought to be a cupboard. But I now saw that it was no cupboard, but rather a black cavity in which there was a little fireplace. Coppelius went to it, and a blue flame began to crackle up on the hearth. All sorts of strange utensils lay around. Heavens, as my old father stooped down to the fire, he looked quite another man. Some convulsive pain seemed to have distorted his mild features into a repulsive, diabolical countenance. He looked like Coppelius, whom I saw brandishing red-hot tongs, which he used to take glowing masses out of the thick smoke, which objects he afterwards hammered. I seemed to catch a glimpse of human faces lying around without any eyes, but with deep holes instead. "Eyes here, eyes," roared Coppelius tonelessly. Overcome by the wildest terror, I shrieked out and fell from my hiding place upon the floor. Coppelius seized me and, baring his teeth, bleated out, "Ah, little wretch! Little wretch!" Then he dragged me up and flung me on the hearth, where the fire began to singe my hair. "Now we have eyes enough, a pretty pair of child's eyes," he whispered, and taking some red-hot grains out of the flames with his bare hands, he was about to sprinkle them in my eyes. My father, upon this, raised his hands in supplication, crying, "Master, master, leave my Nathaniel his eyes!" Whereupon Coppelius answered with a shrill laugh, "Well, let the lad have his eyes and do his share of the world's crying, but we will examine the mechanism of his hands and feet." And then he seized me so roughly that my joints cracked, and screwed off my hands and feet, afterwards putting them back on again, one after the other. "There's something wrong here," he mumbled, "but now it is good as ever. The old man has caught the idea," hissed and lisped Coppelius, but all around me became black. A sudden cramp darted through my bones and nerves, and I lost consciousness. A gentle, warm breath passed over my face. I woke as from the sleep of death. My mother had been stooping over me. "Is the Sandman still there?" I stammered. "No, no, my dear child. He has gone away long ago. He won't hurt you," said my mother, kissing her darling, as he regained his senses. Why should I weary you, my dear Lothair, with diffuse details when I have so much more to tell? Suffice it to say that I had been discovered eavesdropping and ill-used by Coppelius. Agony and terror had brought on delirium and fever, from which I lay sick for several weeks. "Is the Sandman still here? Is the Sandman still there?" That was my first sensible word, and the sign of my amendment, my recovery. I have only to tell you now of this most frightful moment in all my youth, and you will be convinced that it is no fault of my eyes that everything seems colorless to me. You will indeed know that a dark fatality has hung over my life, a gloomy veil of clouds, which I shall perhaps only tear away in death. Coppelius was no more to be seen. It was said he had left the town. About a year might have elapsed, and we were sitting as of old at the round table. My father was very cheerful, and was entertaining us with stories about his travels in his youth, when, as the clock struck 9, we heard the house door groan on its hinges, and slow steps, heavy as lead, creaked through the passage and up the stairs. "That is Coppelius," said my mother, turning pale. "Yes, that is Coppelius," repeated my father in a faint, broken voice. The tears started to my mother's eyes. "But father, father," she cried, "must it be so?" "He is coming for the last time, I promise you," was the answer. "Only go now. Go with the children. Go to bed. Good night." I felt as if I were turned to cold, heavy stone. My breath stopped. My mother caught me by the arm as I stood immovable. Come, Nathaniel." I allowed myself to be led, and entered my chamber. Be quiet, go to bed, go to sleep," cried my mother after me, but tormented by restlessness and an inward anguish perfectly indescribable. I could not close my eyes. The hateful, abominable Coppelius stood before me with fiery eyes and laughed maliciously at me. It was in vain that I endeavored to get rid of his image. About midnight there was a frightful noise like the firing of a gun. The whole house resounded. There was a rattling and rustling by my door, and the house door was closed with a violent bang. "That is Coppelius," I cried, springing out of bed in terror. Then there was a shriek as of acute, inconsolable grief. I darted into my father's room. The door was open, a suffocating smoke rolled towards me, and the servant girl cried, "Ah, my master, my master!" On the floor of the smoking hearth lay my father dead, with his face burned, blackened, and hideously distorted. My sisters were shrieking and moaning around him, and my mother had fainted. "Coppelius, cursed devil, you have slain my father," I cried, and I lost my senses. When, 2 days afterwards, my father was laid in his coffin, his features were again as mild and gentle as they had been in his life. My soul was comforted by the thought that his compact with the satanic Coppelius could not have plunged him into eternal perdition. The explosion had awakened the neighbors. The occurrence had become common talk and had reached the ears of the The explosion had awakened the neighbors. The occurrence had become common talk and had reached the ears of the magistracy, who wished to make Coppelius answerable. He had, however, vanished from the spot without leaving a trace. If I tell you, my dear friend, that the barometer dealer was the accursed Coppelius himself, you will not blame me for regarding so unpropitious a phenomenon as the omen of some dire calamity. He was dressed differently, but the figure and features of Coppelius are too deeply imprinted in my mind for an error in this respect to be possible. Besides, Coppelius has not even altered his name. He describes himself, I am told, as a Piedmontese optician, and calls himself Giuseppe Coppola. I am determined to deal with him, and to avenge my father's death, be the issue what it may. Tell my mother nothing of the hideous monster's appearance. Remember me to my dear sweet Clara, to whom I will write in a calmer mood. Farewell. Clara to Nathaniel. It is true that you have not written to me for a long time, but nevertheless I believe that I am still in your mind and thoughts. For assuredly you were thinking of me most intently when, designing to send your last letter to my brother Lothair, you directed it to me instead of to him. I joyfully opened the letter and did not perceive my error till I came to the words, "Ah, my dear Lothair." No, by rights I should have read no farther, but should have handed over the letter to my brother. Although you have often, in your childish teasing mood, charged me with having such a quiet, womanish, steady disposition that even if the house were about to fall in, I should smooth down a wrong fold in the window curtain in a most ladylike manner before I ran away, I can hardly tell you how your letter shocked me. I could scarcely breathe. The light danced before my eyes. Ah, my dear Nathaniel, how could such a horrible thing have crossed your path? To be parted from you, never to see you again, the thought darted through my breast like a burning dagger. I read on and on. Your description of the repulsive Coppelius is terrifying. I learned for the first time the violent manner of your good old father's death. My brother Lothair, to whom I surrendered the letter, sought to calm me, but in vain. The fatal barometer dealer, Giuseppe Coppola, followed me at every step, and I am almost ashamed to confess that he disturbed my healthy and usually peaceful sleep with all sorts of horrible visions. Yet soon, even the next day, I was quite changed again. Do not be offended, dearest one, if Lothair tells you that in spite of your strange fears that Coppelius will in some manner injure you, I am in the same cheerful and unworried mood as ever. I must honestly confess that, in my opinion, all the terrible things of which you speak occurred merely in your own mind and had little to do with the actual external world. Old Coppelius may have been repulsive enough, but his hatred of children was what really caused the abhorrence you children felt towards him. In your childish mind, the frightful Sandman in the nurse's tale was naturally associated with old Coppelius. Why, even if you had not believed in the Sandman, Coppelius would still have seemed to you a monster, especially dangerous to children. The awful business which he carried on at night with your father was no more than this, that they were making alchemical experiments in secret, which much distressed your mother, since, besides a great deal of money being wasted, your father's mind was filled with a fallacious desire after higher wisdom, and so alienated from his family, as they say is always the case with such experimentalists. Your father, no doubt, occasioned his own death by some act of carelessness of which Coppelius was completely guiltless. Let me tell you that I yesterday asked our neighbor, the apothecary, whether such a sudden and fatal explosion was possible in these chemical experiments. Certainly, he replied, and after his fashion told me at great length and very circumstantially how such an event might take place, uttering a number of strange-sounding names which I am unable to recollect. Now, I know you will be angry with your Clara. You will say that her cold nature is impervious to any ray of the mysterious, which often embraces man with invisible arms, that she only sees the variegated surface of the world and is as delighted as a silly child at some glittering golden fruit which contains within it a deadly poison. Ah, my dear Nathaniel, Can you not then believe that even in open, cheerful, careless minds may dwell the suspicion of some dread power which endeavors to destroy us in our own selves? Forgive me if I, a silly girl, presume in any manner to present to you my thoughts on such an internal struggle. I shall not find the right words, of course, and you will laugh at me, not because my thoughts are foolish, but because I express them so clumsily. If there is a dark and hostile power laying its treacherous toils within us, by which it holds us fast and draws us along the path of peril and destruction, which we should not otherwise have trod, if, I say, there is such a power, it must form itself inside us and out of ourselves indeed. It must become identical with ourselves. For it is only in this condition that we can believe in it and grant it the room which it requires to accomplish its secret work. Now, if we have a mind which is sufficiently firm, sufficiently strengthened by the joy of life, always to recognize this strange enemy as such, and calmly to follow the path of our own inclination and calling, then the dark power will fail in its attempt to gain a form that shall be a reflection of ourselves. Lothair adds that if we have willingly yielded ourselves up to the dark powers, they are known often to impress upon our minds any strange, unfamiliar shape which the external world has thrown in our way, so that we ourselves kindle the spirit, which we in our strange delusion believe to be speaking to us. It is the phantom of our own selves, the close relationship with which and its deep operation on our mind casts us into hell or transports us into heaven. You see, dear Nathaniel, how freely Lothair and I are giving our opinion on the subject of the dark powers, which subject, to judge by my difficulties in writing down, its most important features, appears to be a complicated one. Lothair's last words I do not quite comprehend. I can only suspect that he means, and yet I feel as if it were all very true, get the gruesome advocate Coppelius and the barometer dealer Giuseppe Coppola quite out of your head. I beg of you, be convinced that these strange fears have no power over you, and that it is only a belief in their hostile influence that can make them hostile in reality. If the great disturbance in your mind did not speak from every line of your letter, if your situation did not give me the deepest pain, I could joke about the Sandman advocate and the barometer dealer Coppelius. Cheer up. I have determined to play the part of your guardian spirit. If the ugly Coppelius takes it into his head to annoy you in your dreams, I'll scare him away with loud peals of laughter. I am not a bit afraid of him, nor of his disgusting hands. He shall neither spoil my sweetmeats as an advocate, nor my eyes as a Sandman. Ever yours, my dear Nathaniel. Nathaniel to Lothair. I'm very sorry that in consequence of the error occasioned by my distracted state of mind, Clara broke open the letter intended for you, and read it. She has written me a very profound philosophical epistle, in which she proves at great length that Coppelius and Coppola only exist in my own mind and are phantoms of myself, which will be dissipated directly I recognize them as such. Indeed, it is quite incredible that the mind which so often peers out of those bright, smiling, childish eyes will, with all the charm of a dream, could make such intelligent professorial definitions. She cites you. You, it seems, have been talking about me. I suppose you read her logical lectures so that she may learn to separate and sift all manners acutely. No more of that, please. Besides, it is quite certain that the barometer dealer, Giuseppe Coppola, is not the advocate Coppelius. I attend the lectures of the professor of physics who has lately arrived. His name is the same as that of the famous natural philosopher Spallanzani, and he is of Italian origin. He has known Coppola for years, and moreover, it is clear from his accent that he is really a Piedmontese. Coppelius was a German, but I think no honest one. Calmed I am not, and though you and Clara may consider me a gloomy visionary, I can't get rid of the impression which the accursed face of Coppelius makes upon me. I am glad that Coppola has left the town. So Spallanzani says. The professor is a strange fellow, a little round man with high cheekbones, a sharp nose, pouting lips, and little piercing eyes. Yet you will get a better notion of him than from this description if you look at the portrait of Cagliostro, drawn by Chodorowicki in one of the Berlin annuals. Spallanzani looks like that exactly. I lately went up his stairs and perceived that the curtain, which was generally drawn completely over a glass door, left a little opening on one side. I know not what curiosity impelled me to look through. A very tall and slender lady, extremely well-proportioned and most splendidly attired, sat in the room by a little table on which she had laid her arms, her hands being folded together. She sat opposite the door so that I could see the whole of her angelic countenance. She did not appear to see me, and indeed there was something fixed about her eyes, as if, I might almost say, she had no power of sight. It seemed to me that she was sleeping with her eyes open. I felt very uncomfortable, and therefore I slunk away into the lecture room close at hand. Afterwards I learned that the form I had seen was that of Spallanzani's daughter, Olympia, whom he keeps confined in a very strange and barbarous manner, so that no one can approach her. After all, there may be something the matter with her. She is half-witted, perhaps, or something of the kind. But why should I write you all this? I could have conveyed it better and more circumstantially by word of mouth. For I shall see you in a fortnight. I must again behold my dear, sweet, angelic Clara. My evil mood will then be dispersed, though I must confess that it has been struggling for mastery over me ever since her sensible but vexing letter. Therefore I do not write to her today. 1,000 greetings, etc. Nothing more strange and chimerical can be imagined than the fate of my poor friend, the young student Nathaniel, which I, gracious reader, have undertaken to tell you. Have you ever known something that has completely filled your heart, thoughts and senses to the exclusion of every other object? There was a burning fermentation within you. Your blood seethed like a molten glow through your veins, sending a higher color to your cheeks. Your glance was strange, as if you were seeking in empty space forms invisible to all other eyes, and your speech flowed away into dark sighs. Then your friends asked you, "What is it, my dear sir? What is the matter?" And you wanted to draw the picture in your mind in all its glowing tints, in all its light and shade, and labored hard to find words only to begin. You thought that you should crowd together in the very first sentence all those wonderful, exalted, horrible, comical, frightful events so as to strike every hearer at once as with an electric shock. But every word, everything that takes the form of speech appeared to you colorless, cold, and dead. You hunt and stutter and stammer, and your friends' sober questions blow like icy wind upon your internal fire until it is almost out. Whereas if, like a bold painter, you had first drawn an outline of the internal picture with a few daring strokes, you might with small trouble have laid on the colors brighter and brighter, and the living throng of varied shapes would have borne your friends away with it. Then they would have seen themselves like you in the picture that your mind had bodied forth. Now I must confess to you, kind reader, that no one has really asked me for the history of the young Nathaniel, but you know well enough that I belong to the queer race of authors who, if they have anything in their minds such as I have just described, feel as if everyone who comes near them, and the whole world besides, is insistently demanding, "What is it then? Tell us, my dear friend." Thus was I forcibly compelled to tell you of the momentous life of Nathaniel. The marvelous singularity of the story filled my entire soul, but for that very reason, and because, my dear reader, I had to make you equally inclined to accept the uncanny, which is no small matter, I was puzzled how to begin Nathaniel's story in a manner as inspiring, original, and striking as possible. Once upon a time, the beautiful beginning of every tale was too tame. In the little provincial town of S lived was somewhat better, as it at least prepared for the climax. Or should I dart at once, medias and in res, or should I dart at once with "Go to the devil," cried the student Nathaniel with rage and horror in his wild looks, when the barometer dealer Giuseppe Coppola... I had indeed already written this down, when I fancied that I could detect something ludicrous in the wild looks of the student Nathaniel, whereas the story is not comical at all. No form of language suggested itself to my mind which seemed to reflect ever in the slightest degree the coloring of the internal picture. I resolved that I would not begin it at all. So take, gentle reader, the 3 letters. which friend Lothair was good enough to give me, as the sketch of the picture which I shall endeavor to color more and more brightly as I proceed with my narrative. Perhaps, like a good portrait painter, I may succeed in catching the outline in this way, so that you will realize it is a likeness even without knowing the original, and feel as if you had often seen the person with your own corporeal eyes. Perhaps, dear reader, you will then believe that nothing is stranger and madder than actual life, which the poet can only catch in the form of a dull reflection in a dimly polished mirror. To give you all the information that you will require for a start, we must supplement these letters with the news that shortly after the death of Nathaniel's father, Clara and Lothair, the children of a distant relative, who had likewise died and left them orphans, were taken by Nathaniel's mother into her own home. Clara and Nathaniel formed a strong attachment for each other, and no one in the world having any objection to make, they were betrothed when Nathaniel left the place to pursue his studies in G. And there he is, according to his last letter, attending the lectures of the celebrated professor of physics, Spallanzani. Now, I would proceed in my story with confidence, but at this moment Clara's picture stands so plainly before me that I cannot turn away, as indeed was always the case when she gazed at me with one of her lovely smiles. Clara could not by any means be reckoned beautiful. That was the opinion of all who are, by their calling, competent judges of beauty. Architects, nevertheless, praised the exact symmetry of her frame, and painters considered her neck, shoulders, and bosom almost too chastely formed. But then they all fell in love with her wondrous hair and coloring, comparing her to the Magdalene in Battani's picture at Dresden. One of them, a most fantastical and singular fellow, compared Clara's eyes to a lake by Ruysdael, in which the pure azure of cloudless sky, the wood and flowery field, the whole cheerful life of the rich landscape are reflected. Poets and composers went still further. "What is a lake? What is a mirror?" said they. "Can we look upon the girl without wondrous heavenly music flowing towards us from her glances, to penetrate our inmost soul, so that all there is awakened and stirred? If we don't sing well, then, there is not much in us, as we shall learn from the delicate smile which plays on Clara's lips, when we presume to pipe up before her with something intended to pass for a song, although it is only a confused jumble of notes." So it was. Clara had the vivid fancy of a cheerful, unembarrassed child, a deep, tender, feminine disposition, an acute, clever understanding. Misty dreamers had not a chance with her, since, though she did not talk, talking would have been altogether repugnant to her silent nature. Her bright glance and her firm, ironical smile would say to them, "Good friends, how can you imagine that I shall take your fleeting, shadowy images for real shapes imbued with life and motion?" On this account, Clara was censured by many as cold, unfeeling, and prosaic, while others, who understood life to its clear depths, greatly loved the feeling, acute, childlike girl, but none so much as Nathaniel, whose perception in art and science was clear and strong. Clara was attached to her lover with all her heart, and when he parted from her, the first cloud passed over her life. With what delight, therefore, did she rush into his arms when, as he had promised in his last letter to Lothair, he actually returned to his native town and entered his mother's room. Nathaniel's expectations were completely fulfilled, for directly he saw Clara, he thought neither of the advocate Coppelius nor of her sensible letter. All gloomy forebodings had gone. However, Nathaniel was quite right when he wrote to his friend Lothair that the form of the repulsive barometer dealer Coppola had had a most evil effect on his life. All felt, even in the first days, that Nathaniel had undergone a complete change in his whole being. He sank into a gloomy reverie, and behaved in a strange manner that had never been known to him before, Everything, his whole life, had become to him a dream and a foreboding, and he was always saying that man, although he might think himself free, only served for the cruel sport of dark powers. These, he said, it was vain to resist. Man must patiently resign himself to his fate. He even went so far as to say that it is foolish to think that we do anything in art and science according to our own independent will, For the inspiration, which alone enables us to produce anything, does not proceed from within ourselves, but is the effect of a higher principle without. To the clear-headed Clara, this mysticism was in the highest degree repugnant, but contradiction appeared to be useless. Only when Nathaniel proved that Coppelius was the evil principle, which had seized him at the moment when he was listening behind the curtain, and that this repugnant principle would in some horrible manner disturb the happiness of their life, Clara grew very serious and said, "Yes, Nathaniel, you are right. Coppelius is an evil, hostile principle. He can produce terrible effects like a diabolical power that has come visibly into life, but only if you will not banish him from your mind and thoughts. So long as you believe in him, he really exists and exerts his influence. His power lies only in your belief." Quite indignant that Clara did not admit the demon's existence outside his own mind, Nathaniel would then come out with all the mystical doctrine of devils and powers of evil, but Clara would break off peevishly by introducing some indifferent matter, to the no small annoyance of Nathaniel. He thought that such deep secrets were closed to cold, unreceptive minds, without being clearly aware that he was counting Clara among these subordinate natures, and therefore he constantly endeavored to initiate her into the mysteries. Thanks for joining me on the wild ride of the Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann, a story that is no more or no less than 200 years of age. Fascinating, the contemporary nature of the language, the feeling. What fun. Join me tomorrow night for its conclusion here in our little weirding hour of 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be well, and be good to each other.